Okay, so I'm a computational neuroscience researcher. Paper that I want to discuss in this video is kind of an extension of hidden Markov models for really complicated, large-scale, nonlinear brain data sets. And I'm going to touch on the motivation first before presenting my hypothesis, and then discuss the model presented in this paper and show the results and discuss my further interest in the application. So to speak to the motivation as discussed, systems neuroscience is a field that is much older than computational neuroscience, and systems neuroscience has done a really good job of creating this map of the brain with these different regions that contribute to different cognitive functions. So the example that I want to focus on would be the visual cortex, which it's been established is utilized for object recognition. And the computational neuroscience would then go in and say, well, actually, the computational structure that underlies this is these hierarchical pooling layers similar to convolutional neural networks. So while the systems neuroscientist has created these maps, the job of the computational neuroscientist is to start to get at the underlying computational structure of these regions and create models of that computation, how these regions interact. So the motivation, like my background reading has been in these models, but my hypothesis is that these models should be partitioned by region to enable us to look at the computational structures within region rather than the brain as a whole. So to speak first to the data that we're collecting, we have these rigs that collect really rich, sophisticated data from animals such as fish or sometimes monkeys. So I focus a lot on C. elegans in this. This, I believe, is a C. elegans rig. So there'd be a freely moving C. elegans here, and it would have a super high resolution recording, I think, of calcium imaging of the activations of all the different neurons. And there's two techniques that we can take right away to try and make sense of this really complicated data. The first is that most of this high dimensional data rests on a much lower dimensional manifold. And the reason that this might be true is that most of these neural states exist within these higher level behavioral states. So with the example of the C. elegans, for example, might be turning or going forward or backward. And within these actions, the neural states don't actually change that much. So if it was turning, for example, and the C. elegans is here, then the state when the C. elegans is still turning, but it's over here, is going to be very similar. And so the point in neural state space of the activations here might be very close to here and rest on a lower dimensional manifold. So we want to construct a model that can pull out these lower dimensional manifolds as continuous latent states, but also partition them according to these discrete latent states, which are higher order and modulate for these behaviors. So like playing with C. elegans again, the higher level discrete states would be like forward turning, reverse other turn. And then the lower level latent states would have to be how the neurons encode for the actual motor controls of this particular action. Okay, so there are already probabilistic graphical models that can model this kind of thing. So this is the switching linear dynamical system that was developed a pretty long time ago. And in particular, there are these hidden continuous latent states that model like this rich here it's linear, but the point is they're continuous and they're rich, and their transitions are parameterized by these discrete switching variables. So n would be the transition matrix with some noise. Probably this would parameterize a Gaussian, and it would be indexed by the switch variable. So like the linear transition here to the behavior might look different based on, in the C. elegans example, if the switch variable encodes for turning or going backwards or something. So I want to point out that this graph structure is incredibly limited as is because the switch states only depend on this prior switch state. And so if in the context of the C elegant, if it's trying to complete a turn, it can't know when it's completed the turn other than like counting how many turn states have occurred. But if it's doing a task that depends on some end, like getting food, then that can't be expressed by this model. So this is like more in line with my background reading. This is a recurrent switching linear dynamical system, and all it does is introduce this edge from the continuous latent state to the discrete state, which allows it to have this expressivity where it needs to reach some continuous latent state configuration in order to transition to the next discrete state. Okay, so as I said before, my hypothesis is that we need to basically partition these hidden states by brain region. And as we'll find, we need to partition these transitions between states by region, which will allow us to like uncover how the different regions communicate within themselves and also within each other, which can speak to the underlying computational structure within region and how distributed intelligence enables cooperation between regions. So this is addressed in the recurrent switching linear dynamical system for multiple regions of neural populations. So this is the original model, and you can see the hidden state is multiplied by this giant transition matrix. And the only thing that's introduced by this paper, or like the main innovation from this paper, is that we partition transition matrix by region. So this is now saying that the jth latent region is transitioned on by this like block matrix within the greater transition, within the greater transition matrix, and that we sum over all of the other latent states which have these separate like within or like across region transition matrices. And then also the discrete state needs to be updated to reflect this. So now instead of the discrete state getting multiplied by this giant transition matrix, the discrete state is also partitioned. You can ignore that there are two terms here. The more important takeaway here is that the discrete transition is partitioned by state or by region. Okay, so I'll move to the results of this paper. So this is just like a proof of concept. This is the ground truth. So there was actually a system that was noisy and generated based on discrete states with these transition dynamics. And we basically find that the model pulls this out so it can learn. That's very exciting. So we look first at the free moving C elegant. So like this is probably the first figure to look at. We have these annotated discrete states encoding for these different behaviors. So this is like what we observed that the C elegant was doing at this time. And we can see that the model pulls out these inferred discrete states that overlap with the annotations. So maybe these first three discrete states encode for when it's reversing, and then these three for when it's going slow, and then this one for ventral turn, dorsal turn, and these two for reversing. What else can we do with this model? Okay, so here's our neural data. We can tell which, these are our populations of neurons. So we can tell which population of neuron corresponds with which transition to different discrete states. So we can tell that, for example, that the SMDD population encodes for transitioning to state 7, which is purple, which is reversal, and then red, which is slow, is encoded by the RMEV and RIS populations. Very exciting stuff that is pulled out with an unsupervised model that is able to infer multiple region dynamics. This is a full other task in a monkey. This monkey is doing it like a grasping versus delay task. So there's recordings in the premotor dorsal lateral cortex versus the motor cortex, I suppose. And my understanding is that the premotor cortex encodes when the monkey plans on doing a task versus the motor is what encodes for the actual motor controls that like execute the task. So we can see that it's in two states. There's an intermediate state, so 3 states. This is the delayed state in the task, and this is when it needs to grasp. And we can see that the premotor dorsolateral cortex is active during these transitions, and that the motor cortex is active during the motor task. So it encodes for these transitions, and we can get a better look at the within network dynamics with the learned region-wise transition matrices. Okay, so I'm going to speak to my personal motivation here. So my work this last semester has been working on human fMRI data from like naturalistic movies. So in particular, I'm building emotion classifiers from people in fMRI machine watching Forrest Gump. And I'd like to apply this technique to these people watching this movie because I think the latent states would immediately pull out some interesting representations of the film. I'd imagine that if we had these discrete states, they could encode for things like characters or whatever high-level representations the subject is forming of the movie. I think it could speak to their individual psychology, what the latent states pull out. And moreover, this technique is totally unsupervised and scalable. And I think could speak to the subjective experience of thought, because to me, thought seems to be partitioned by these sort of discrete latent states. So that is my whole presentation. Thank you for listening to me, and I really enjoyed this course.